We've all heard of fossils, and many of us probably think we know what they are.
The word fossil comes from the French word fossile, which means obtained by digging. And that word comes from the Latin word fossus, which means dug up.
The definition of a fossil is any preserved impression, trace, or remain of a once living organism. Fossils are evidence of life on
Planet Krypton!
In order to be considered a fossil, typically a specimen has to be over 10,000 years old.
An important thing to remember is that fossils aren't actually the organism themselves. They're an impression of the organism, such as a mold or a cast, or a trace of the organism, such as a burrow or a footprint that the organism left behind. So when you're holding the thing that looks like a clam, you're not actually holding a dead organism that looks like a clam. You're holding a rock that looks like the dead organism that looks like a clam.
So you might wonder, why do we generally only find the bones of organisms? And why don't we find the entire dinosaur or the entire woolly mammoth? Well, that's because the organs and the flesh tend to decay quickly in the soil, and bones and harder stuff like shells and teeth usually last longer enough time to fossilize.
The fossils that we find today are thousands to billions to even millions of years old.
What?
I really wish you went from billions to millions to even thousands of years old.
The fossils that we find today are from organisms that lived thousands to millions to even billions of years ago. The oldest fossils that have been found are 3.48 billion years old. These are unicellular and bacterial organisms that are representations of the earliest forms of life on Earth.
The first multicellular organism probably emerged around 1 billion years ago. Larger multicellular creatures that are more like the size of what we have today likely emerged around 635 million years ago.
At around 541 million years ago, there was an eruption of life on Earth. This eruption of life happened in the oceans, and because these organisms lived underwater, it put them in an environment that lended itself really well to fossilization.
When we look at fossils and the history of life on Earth, there are three main eras. The Paleozoic, which is the development of life on Earth, as well as the first land organisms. The Mesozoic, which is the age of dinosaurs, and the Cenozoic, which is the age of mammals, and it goes to the present.
Fossils from each of these eras allow us to see what life looked like then, what the Earth may have looked like, and how life has developed into what we see today. All of these fossils are collectively known as the fossil record.
Lots of information can be obtained from looking at fossils.
That's good.
Facts. Okay. Lots of information can be obtained from looking at fossils. For example, if an area has a lot of marine fossils, we can hypothesize that that area was most likely underwater at some point.
We can also use fossils to help us determine the age of different layers of the Earth, or strata, by noticing where similar fossils occur around the globe.
Fossils also show how organisms have changed into what we see them as today. Many of the fossils tend to be of marine or land.
I'm just looking at you like...
No, you just went.
No.
You gave me side eye.
No, I went like...
Criminal side eye.
Okay.
Fossils tend to be of marine organisms or dinosaurs, but they can also include early human ancestors, and that gives us information as to where they may have lived historically.
There are a few different categories of fossils. The first two categories are microfossils and macrofossils.
Microfossils are fossils of organisms or organic matter that are so small that you need a microscope to see them. This includes fossils such as single-celled organisms or a pollen grain.
Macrofossils are large fossils, and they're the fossils of things that we're familiar with, such as dinosaur bones, trilobites, ammonites, and petrified wood.
The next two categories are trace and body fossils. Trace fossils are a record of the biological activities of an organism. This includes fossilized evidence of tracks, footprints, burrows, or poop. These can yield information about the type of organism that left them, such as how the organism moved or where it lived.
Within this category of body fossils, there are two more categories, which are mold and...
Just mold.
Mold.
There's mold.
There are two more categories of mold. Body fossils are preserved evidence of the remains of the organisms themselves. These tend to be the harder things, such as the skeletons or the shells of the organism, because the softer tissues tend to decay too quickly to fossilize. Within this category, there are two other categories, which are mold and cast fossils.
Molds are the impressions left by organisms on the rock surrounding them. External molds are impressions of the outside of the organic matter. Internal molds are impressions of the inside of the organic matter. Casts are replicas of organic matter formed from molds. This occurs when minerals fill the molds to create a replica of the organism.
Certain fossils are categorized as index fossils. Index fossils are fossils that are widespread, but were specific to a certain time period. This allows us to know that when we find these fossils in a certain strata, that strata formed within that time frame. We also know that when we find these fossils in widespread areas across the world, those strata areas probably formed at the same time period and could have been connected at some point.